The called out assembly of God is growing, and then persecution arises under the leadership of Saul of Tarsus. And the 12th chapter of Acts tells us that Herod, the king, arrested, had James, one of the All right, we were talking about Herod having James, one of the apostles, killed. And it goes on to tell us here in Acts chapter 12 that Herod saw that this pleased the Jews, the unbelieving Jews who were persecuting Christians, and so he had Peter arrested and locked him up in prison. And after the time of Passover, he was going to bring Peter before the people and probably have him executed too, was the intention. And had Peter locked up in prison. And it says here that the whole assembly, all those called out, King James calls the church, was praying for him. It says, but prayer was made without ceasing of the called out assembly unto God for him, or the congregation. All the congregation was praying for Peter. And the record tells how that an angel came there and released Peter from the prison, took him out past the guards and turned him loose. And he went back, says to, let's see, in verse 12 of Acts 12, and when he, that's Peter, had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. Now there's a crowd of people gathered at this house where John Mark's mother lived, and they were praying for Peter's release, that he would not be killed like James was. And verse 13, and as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, says, a damsel, a young woman, came to hear it and to respond to the knock at the door. Her name was Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. And they said to her, thou art mad. But she consistently or confidently affirmed that it was even so. And they said, well, it's his angel. But Peter kept knocking, and they went and finally opened the door to him. They were astonished, it says. Now the reason for calling that to your attention is they were having what we might call a prayer meeting. They had a gathering of people there, and they were praying for Peter's release. Well, this young woman named Rhoda heard somebody knocking at the gate or the door. She went out there and she heard Peter's voice, and she was so excited that she didn't let him in. She just turned around and ran back right in the middle of the prayer meeting and said, hey, said, Peter's out here at the gate. Peter's at the gate. And they said, well, there's something wrong with you. That can't be. And that's interesting that how weak our faith is and how weak theirs was. They're praying for his release, and when she comes in and tells them he's there, they couldn't believe it. Here, though, is an example where a young woman interrupted a prayer meeting to make an announcement and tell them that Peter was outside. Now, you can take it for what it's worth. I'm just calling these to your attention, and we're going to go on here and keep laying this stuff down and try eventually to come up with some logical understanding of what our subject is. What I've been trying to do now for a good while is to first of all show the responsibility of husbands to their wives and how we're supposed to be loving and kind and patient with them, even as Christ is with us. Secondly, to try to give you examples that show that there were women who followed along with Jesus in his ministry. And in the days of the apostles, apparently women did not just go around with a veil over their face looking down at the ground and only speak when they were spoken to. I'm intent on debunking that idea. But at the same time, the Lord willing, here in a little while, I'm going to go back to where Paul says, let your women keep silent in the assembly. And it goes on and says, for it is a shame for a woman or for women to speak in the assembly. We're trying to deal with that, but I'm trying to set the stage here and supply us with enough information so that we can hopefully come to a conclusion that will at least be close to what Paul was saying to those Corinthian disciples. I'm going to continue now with some more information. This is going to Acts chapter 16. Again, of course, this is under the new covenant. In this case, by this time now, Saul of Tarsus has seen Christ on the road to Damascus, and it is thus qualified to be an apostle. Ananias is sent to him, tell him what to do to be saved, and Paul now is he has become a proclaimer and a witness for this Jesus of Nazareth, whom he had so harshly and unmercifully persecuted prior to his call to be an apostle and his conversion to Christ. And in Paul, I believe Paul and Silas, I think, are in the city of Philippi. Acts chapter 16, starting in the 14th verse of that chapter. Says, and a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us. That Luke was in the presence. He's writing this. Whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended to the things which were spoken of Paul. Occasionally, I should have told you back before this just a little bit. There was a place in that city of Philippi, somewhere down there by the river, it says, where these people would go there to pray. And Paul and Silas and their company went down there, and they found a group of women that had gone there apparently to pray. And Paul begins to teach them, and no doubt explain to them that Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ and so forth. It says here that God opened her heart, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And when she was baptized, and her household, she besought us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide here. And she constrained us. All right? Now, there's a lot of information there that we could deal with, but what I'm wanting to call this to your attention for is, here was a businesswoman. She was a seller of purple. I don't know if that was a dye that was used to dye cloth, or whether it was the material itself after it already been dyed. I probably could research it and find it, but I don't know at this time. But the important part is, she was a businesswoman. She had a household, verse 15. And she invited Paul and his company to come in and stay with her while they were there in that city. And apparently they did, and continued to go down there every so often to that place of prayer and teach people that came there. So that indicates to me that here was a woman who was engaged in a business venture. She had a household, no doubt had servants, and you can say, well, I'm going too far with my imagination. Maybe I am, but to me it logically implies that she told servants to go here, yonder, and there, and do this, do that. Giving you a little more insight to how the part that women played in the society and according to the customs of that time and place. Now, Acts 17. Go a little farther. Acts 17, verse 1. Now, Paul is traveling on here, and they came to a city of Thessalonica, and there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, verse 2 says, went into them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. That's these old Hebrew prophets we talked about. It says he was opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus whom I preach unto you is Christ. Now remember, these were Jews in that synagogue. They had a meeting there every Sabbath, still following the Mosaic system. And Paul goes there, and he knows these people, they've been looking for this Messiah, this Christ. And he goes in and he takes these Old Testament passages and shows and testifies how Jesus had fulfilled those prophecies and is therefore the Christ. And verse 4 says, and some of them believed and consorted. I take that to mean they followed after Paul and Silas and their teaching. And it says, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. Now, again, the way I read that leads me to the conclusion that there were women in those meetings at the synagogue. Seems to me that there were, and they're called chief women. And it said not a few of them, there were several of them that believed the teaching of Paul that Jesus of Nazareth is Christ. And they not only were there at the assembly, but they were called chief women. That's the same word that's translated back in one of the letters that Paul wrote, where he said that he was the chief of sinners. Yeah, here it is in my notes, 1 Timothy 1:15. I won't turn to it. But Paul described himself as being the chief of sinners. The number one, foremost. And these were number one women. These were outstanding women. These were prominent women called chief women. Now, Acts 17:10 through 12. Still following Paul now as he travels. Let's see where he was. He goes to Berea. And these were the ones that were more noble, and they searched the Scriptures daily to see if the things Paul was teaching was true. So therefore they received the word with readiness of mind. And verse 12 says, we're still in Acts 17, therefore many of them believed, also of honorable women, which were Greeks, and of men, not a few. Now, it's just rather intriguing to me why why Luke chooses to specify that there were both men and women who believed. And again, these women are called honorable women. They were honored. They held a place of note, of worthiness, and had respect in the community. Okay, let's see what we got next. Okay, that's the end of that list of activities and descriptions that I have chosen to bring to your attention, trying to shed some light on the mannerisms and the customs and the positions and activities that women held in this particular age that we're talking about. We'll go back now to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. None of what I've read to you is intended in any way to be in conflict with Paul's instructions, which he described as being part of the commands of the Lord. However, these passages that I have brought to your attention hopefully will help us to obtain a more accurate understanding of what Paul is trying to get over to these disciples in these verses that I have been talking about for a good while. 1 Corinthians 14. I'll read it again in your hearing. Let your women keep silence in the churches, the assemblies. For it is not permitted to them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. For it is a shame for women to speak in the church. And I still, the more I study it, I'm convinced that that is better understood as in the congregation or the assembly. I'm going to mention it again later, but it is for certain. He's not talking about them not speaking in some particular building. I think we had a lot of confusion of that in the past. Again, as I said earlier in this study, if there was not other evidence, another passage of Scripture, which I've already tried to bring some of them to your attention, we would naturally and logically conclude that it would mean that a woman could not open her mouth, could not speak a word in the assembly. But and we've talked about where he says, as also saith the law. And I call your attention back to those passages where there were women who were judges and prophetesses even under the law of Moses. And also, now I ask, how shall we try to understand this text that says a woman cannot, it said, for to keep silence in the assembly, it's a shame for her to speak in the assembly. What, first of all, how would we interpret the term in the church or in the assembly? What exactly constitutes an assembly? In 1 Corinthians 14:23, Paul says, he makes reference to a time, he says, if therefore the whole church be come together, if the whole congregation be come together into one place, then so and so and so and so. So there were times apparently when, at least figuratively speaking, the whole number, the total number of disciples in a certain area would come together for a meeting. Would it take the entire congregation to come together to constitute an assembly that Paul is talking about here? I seriously doubt it. What if one was sick and couldn't be there? Then there's Matthew 18:20, where Jesus said that where two or three were gathered together in His name, there He'd be in the midst of them. Obviously, we said a while ago, it's not what kind of building or place whether they were in a so-called church building or not. So what kind of an assembly was this in which they were not supposed to speak? I'm going to share some things with you here now that I've tried to be honest with you, and I hate to keep bringing stuff up, but here's what used to be the tradition where among the disciples that I grew up with. They had a sign out in front of the building, and some of them still do, announcing the time of what they call services. And it'll say 10 o'clock Bible study, 11 o'clock worship. And then it'll have underneath that 6 o'clock p.m. Sunday. Then, of course, you've got the Wednesday night that I think is most times called Bible study. Now, to the best of my memory, and I can call it back, I believe I'm correct, it was generally held, although there was some controversy about it, but generally held that in the 10 o'clock Bible study, that a woman could ask a question, or she could make a comment on the text that was being studied, although some were hesitant to do that. Especially because it was inside the church building. It's comparable to, by the way, the idea of people talking about whether it was all right to eat in the church building. Now some of them didn't think it was, so they'd put up a little shed out there with picnic tables on it right next to the building, or build a separate building right next to it, call it the fellowship hall, and you could go over there and eat, but you couldn't have a picnic in the same building where you did what we call worship and called the church building. I don't think that's the answer. There's something we were missing, and I'm not sure I found all of it. I think I've found some of it. But I don't think we had the answer to say that a woman could participate in the discussion in the hour between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, but at 11 o'clock we call that worship, time of worship. And by the way, with something we're going to talk about, we said there's 5 things you had to do there. We had to sing, pray, have Bible study. How many? Sing, pray, Bible study, giving, some money, and the Lord's Supper. That was 5 acts of worship, we called it. We'll talk about that a little further someday. Now, if Bible study between what we call Bible study or preaching between 11 and 12 was worship, how come Bible study between 10 and 11 wasn't worship? And we tried to say that a woman wasn't supposed to speak in the worship, during the worship service. She was supposed to be quiet. And there's even, people would object. Sometimes some man would get up and maybe sometimes even the preacher, the professional preacher, would get up and ask, he'd make some announcements and then he'd say, does anybody have any other announcements that need to be made? And on rare occasion, a woman would say, oh yeah, I said, so-and-so's got real sick and they had to take him to the hospital. I might let people know that. And people would say, oh, she shouldn't have done that. Well, that's the tradition that I grew up with. We'll see. I may have mentioned this before too, and I remember one time my mother and I was just a boy, and we were cleaning the building, the church building. And I was going along with a rag, dusting the backs of the benches, the pews, whatever you call them, and I was whistling. And Mama said, shh, don't whistle in the church house, honey. And I'm not criticizing her, not making fun of her. She was a God-fearing woman, and I appreciate the training she gave me. But it was the we had some special feeling for that particular building, and whistling in there wouldn't be a good idea. I think it's connected with this tradition we had. I also remember, looking at my notes here, I remember an occasion where we used to have, and still do have, what's called preacher training schools. And they did a lot of good, still do a lot of good, I'm sure. But I remember somebody talking about a certain preacher training school. They called in a woman to teach these young men English grammar, but she couldn't teach them the Bible. And I've often wondered whether, if what if it came up to where there was a question about how you ought to, how is this right here supposed to be, how is this word in John 3:16 or whatever, Romans so-and-so, how is this word supposed to be pronounced? Could she read that verse to them and tell how to be pronounced, And it's right at this point that somebody's going to say, and I don't blame you a bit, I don't blame you a bit for saying it, somebody's going to say, why are you sweating the little stuff? Well, I've made myself a note down here later to talk some about that. I'll tell you what I would do. I'd be willing to just say, I'll just forget the whole thing, don't amount to nothing. Except for one thing. And I've mentioned to you before. In 1 Corinthians 14, right after he got through telling them to be silent in the assembly and so forth,